He had a scar on the back of his right hand that he never talked about, and a way of fixing things that made you think he had been born, knowing how. His name was Everett Coles, and he was 47 years old when he first rode up the lane to the Hadley property with a broken axle on his wagon and a look on his face that said he was used to things going wrong and used to fixing them himself. He did not ask for help. He simply pulled the wagon off to the side of the road, unhitched his horse, and walked to the fence line where the property began. He stood there a moment, hat in hand, looking at the house the way a man looks at something he does not yet have permission to approach. Josephine Hadley was 26 years old that August, and she was on the porch when she saw him. She had her mother's practicality and her father's stubbornness, and she had used both of those things to run the east quarter of the farm since she was 22, after her father's knee gave out the second time, and the doctor told him the third time would likely be the last. She had turned down 2 proposals, one from a banker's son in town who smelled of cedar oil and said we when he meant you, and one from a neighboring farmer who was perfectly kind but who looked at her the way a man looks at land he wants to acquire. She had told her mother after the second one that she was not opposed to marriage. She was opposed to being managed. She watched Everett Coles stand at the fence line for a full 30 seconds before she called out to him. "Are you going to stand there until dark, or did you want something?" He looked up. He had the kind of face that had spent a long time in weather, not old exactly, but settled. He was 47, though she did not know that yet. He said, "I was trying to decide if it was polite to knock." "It's a fence," she said, "not a door." He almost smiled. She noticed that, the almost. "My axle broke," he said. "I was hoping you might have a block I could borrow. I'll have it back to you by morning." Her father, 64-year-old George Hadley, was inside at the kitchen table, pretending to read but actually listening through the screen door, the way he always did when someone came up the lane. He had a talent for listening without appearing to. His wife, 61-year-old Norma Hadley, was at the stove and not pretending to do anything other than pay close attention. Josephine came down off the porch. She looked at the wagon. She looked at Everett. She said, "Where are you headed?" "North of Pincher Creek," he said. "I've got a contract to repair a church roof before September. You a carpenter," among other things. She lent him the block. She also, without being asked, brought out a wrench that fit the bolt he was working with because she had watched him for 2 minutes and could see the one he had was the wrong size. He looked at the wrench. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "I want it back." He returned the block and the wrench the following morning, exactly as he said he would. He also left 3 fence posts he had cut and smoothed on his way back through, stacked neatly at the gate with a note tucked under the top one. The note said, "I noticed 2 of yours were splitting. These are cedar. They'll last longer." Norma read the note twice before she handed it to George. George read it once, set it on the table, and went back to his coffee. But he did not throw it away. Everett Coles had grown up outside of Lethbridge, Alberta, the younger of 2 sons in a family that had more land than money and more pride than either. He had learned to build things from his father, to fix things from necessity, and to be quiet from watching men who talk too much accomplish very little. He had been married once, briefly, in his early 30s, a woman named Helen, who had been kind, and whom he had been kind to, but who had wanted a life that included a town and a future that did not involve mud season. They had parted without bitterness. He had no children. He was not sure if that was a sorrow or simply a fact. On most days, it felt like the latter. He had his own small property west of Fort Macleod, 12 acres, a good workshop, a house he had built himself over 5 winters, adding a room each year as he had the lumber and the time. It was not impressive from the road, but every joint in it was true, and every beam was level, and on cold nights it held heat, the way a well-built thing holds everything it is supposed to hold. He did not go back to the Hadley farm for 3 weeks after he returned the wrench. When he did, it was because he was passing through anyway on a job, and he told himself that was the only reason. He stopped at the gate and called out, and Josephine appeared from around the side of the barn with grease on her hands and a look that said she was in the middle of something. "The hydraulic pump on the tractor," she said before he could ask. "Third time this summer." "I know that pump," he said. "The seal goes." "Yes," she said. "I know that too." He did not offer to help. He had learned in 47 years that some women want help and some women want company, while they help themselves, and that the second kind are considerably more interesting. He leaned on the fence and said nothing, and after a moment she said, "You can come around if you want. I could use someone to hold the light." He held the light for 40 minutes while she worked. She was methodical and exact, and she did not talk while she was thinking. He appreciated that. When she was done, she stood up and wiped her hands on a rag and looked at him the way his father used to look at him after he had done something that passed muster. Not warm, exactly, but not cold either. A kind of acknowledgement. "Coffee?" she said. "If it's no trouble." "Everything's some trouble," she said. "That doesn't mean it isn't worth it." They sat on the porch for an hour. George came out after 20 minutes, lowered himself into his chair with the careful dignity of a man whose body has opinions, and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You did the Carmichael church?" "Finished it in August," Everett said. "Heard it came out well." "It came out level," Everett said. "Which is the most a roof can ask for." George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How old are you?" 47. George looked at his daughter. Josephine was looking at the field. George looked back at Everett. "Long drive from Fort Macleod," he said. "Not so long," Everett said, and that was all that was said about it. He came back 4 more times before the first snow. Once to bring a length of cedar planking Josephine had asked about at the feed store. She hadn't asked him, she'd asked the man at the counter, but Everett had been 3 feet away and happened to have exactly the length she needed in the back of his truck. Once, because a late September storm had taken down a section of the Hadleys' north fence, and George's knee would not allow him to work in the rain. Once because Norma had sent word through the Carmichael family that there was a door frame in the kitchen that had warped, and she'd heard he was good with doors. And once, that last time in October, for no reason either of them acknowledged or explained. That last visit, he and Josephine walked the fence line in the afternoon. It was cold, and the grass had gone yellow, and the light had that flat October quality that makes the prairie look like a painting of itself. They did not talk much. At one point she stopped at a gate latch that had come loose and crouched down to look at it, and he crouched beside her, and for a moment they were both just looking at the latch, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. "It needs a longer pin," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him then, sideways, and there was something in her face he had not seen before. Not softness, exactly, but something that had stopped guarding itself for a moment. She was 26 years old, and she looked, in that instant, exactly her age, which was something he had not expected to find as moving as he did. She looked back at the latch. "I'll get one in town," she said. "I have one in the truck," he said. She stood up. "Of course you do," she said, and walked back toward the house, and he thought he heard something in her voice that might have been a smile. "Now, I want to stop here for just a moment and speak to you directly. If you're listening to this story, whether you're somewhere in Ontario or British Columbia, out on the prairies, or anywhere else across this wide country, I want to ask you something. Have you ever met someone and thought to yourself, this person knows how to be still, that quiet, that steadiness? It's rarer than people think. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from today. And if this story is speaking to you, a like goes a long way toward keeping these tales alive. Now, back to Everett and Josephine. George Hadley was not a complicated man, but he was a careful one. He had built the farm over 30 years with his wife and his hands, and a stubbornness that his children had inherited in full. He loved Josephine with the particular ferocity of a father who has watched his daughter be more capable than everyone around her and still be underestimated anyway. He had seen the two men she had turned down, and he had understood why she turned them down, and he had not said anything either time because she had not needed him to. He thought about Everett Coles for most of November. He thought about the fence posts, cut and smoothed and left without fanfare. He thought about the wrench that came back the next morning. He thought about the way the man had held the light for 40 minutes without saying a word, without trying to take the wrench from Josephine's hand, without doing anything except exactly what he had been asked to do. He thought about the church roof that had come out level. He thought about a man of 47 who drove 40 minutes each way to bring cedar planking, and who, when asked why, said only that he was passing through. George had been young once. He knew what passing through looked like, and he knew what it did not look like. The Sunday before Christmas, he asked Everett to come by for supper. Not through Norma, not through the Carmicales. He asked him directly, at the hardware store in town, where both of them happened to be at the same time, which Norma had also engineered, though neither man ever quite worked that out. Everett came. He brought a bottle of wine he had thought about for 2 days, and a small jar of wild clover honey from his own hives, because he thought the wine might seem like too much, and the honey alone might seem like too little. Josephine saw the honey and looked at him for a long moment. "You keep bees?" she said. "Since I was 30, he said. She said, and went back to the kitchen, and Norma caught the look on her daughter's face and said nothing and smiled into the pot she was stirring. Supper was long and easy. George asked questions about the Fort Macleod property, about the workshop, about how the 12 acres were laid out. Everett answered plainly. He did not make himself sound like more than he was, and he did not apologize for being what he was. He was a carpenter and a beekeeper and a man who fixed things. He had a house he had built himself. He was 47 years old, and he had no illusions about what that meant. At one point, George said, "Josephine says you built the house yourself, off-app." "Over 5 winters," Everett said, "a room at a time. Any rooms left to build?" Everett was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he said, "1 or 2. George picked up his fork. Norma looked at the ceiling. Josephine did not look at anyone. After supper, while Norma and Josephine were in the kitchen, George and Everett sat on opposite sides of the fireplace. It was a cold December night and the fire was good. George's knee was bothering him. Everett could see it in the way the man held himself, carefully, like he was rationing his movement. George said, without preamble, "She's 26, I know." Everett said, "You're 47. "Yes." George looked at the fire for a while. Then he said, "Her mother was 22 when I married her. I was 39. Everett did not say anything. He had not known that. George said, "I'm not opposed to the age. I want to be clear about that." He shifted his weight, and something in his face tightened for a second before it settled. "What I'm opposed to is a man who thinks he's doing a young woman a favor by wanting her." "I know," Everett said again. "Do you?" Everett looked at him then. Directly, he said, "She turned down a banker's son and a farmer who had more land than I'll ever have. She did that because she could see what they wanted. I'm not going to insult her by pretending she can't see what I want too. She can. She's the sharpest person I've met in 20 years. What I'm hoping is that what I want happens to line up with what she wants, and that if it doesn't, she'll tell me so. And I'll listen." George was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She will tell you. That is not in question." "No," Everett said, "it's not." Another silence. The fire shifted. Outside, the wind had picked up and was running along the edge of the eaves in the way it does on the Alberta prairie in December. Not howling, exactly, but persistent. "Certain," George said. "She's been running the East Quarter for 4 years. She knows every foot of this land." "I know she does." She's not going to give that up. I wouldn't ask her to." George looked at him again. He had the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years watching weather and livestock and the kind of people who showed up at your gate when things went wrong, and he was very good at reading what he saw. He said, "I'm going to ask you to do something," Everett said. "All right. Come back in spring," George said. "Help us with the lambing. We're short 2 hands this year, and my knee isn't going to improve between now and March. You work the spring with us. Not for wages, just work. And at the end of it, if Josephine wants to have a conversation, you have a conversation. If she doesn't, you go home and we don't speak of it again." Everett thought for exactly as long as it took him to be sure of his answer. He said, "I'll be here in March. I know you will," George said. It sounded less like a compliment than like a fact he had already decided on. He told no one what George had said to him, and George told no one what Everett had said. Norma figured it out by the end of the week from the way George made his coffee the next morning. Slower than usual, more deliberate, the way he moved when something had been settled. She said nothing to Josephine. She started knitting a pair of socks in a dark green wool she had been saving, and she was not knitting them for George. Josephine did not know about the conversation. What she knew was that Everett Coles had come to supper on a Sunday in December and had brought clover honey and had talked to her father for 2 hours, and that when he left, he had said to her at the door, quietly, without drama, "I'll see you in March." And then he had gone out into the cold. She stood at the window after and watched his truck lights disappear down the lane. She was 26 years old, and she had run 400 acres of East Quarter farmland by herself since she was 22, and she was not a person who was easily surprised by anything. She was surprised. She did not say anything to her mother. She went upstairs and lay on her bed in the dark for a while, looking at the ceiling. She thought about the wrench she had lent him, the right-sized wrench, which she had brought out without being asked, and the way he had looked at it and then at her. She thought about the fence posts, smooth and cedar-scented, left at the gate without a word. She thought about 40 minutes in the barn with a flashlight and a man who knew how to be useful without making you feel obligated for it. She thought about a house built 1 room at a time over 5 winters, a room at a time. She understood that way of building things. She had always thought that was the only honest way. She was still awake at midnight. Outside, the Alberta winter was doing what it always did, making the world smaller, quieter, more itself. March came with mud and cold in equal measure, the way it always does on the prairie, the kind of cold that does not announce itself, but simply stays, settled into the ground, and the fence posts and the corners of every unheated building. Everett arrived on a Tuesday morning with his truck and his tools, and a pair of boots that had seen real mud before. George met him at the gate. George's knee was worse than it had been in December. Everett could see it in the way the man walked, careful and deliberate, like a man who has learned to negotiate with his own body. He did not say so. He shook George's hand and followed him to the barn. The lambing that spring was harder than most. A late storm in the 2nd week of March brought down a section of the roof on the old shed where 3 of the ewes were housed, and Everett had it repaired before Josephine had finished moving the animals to the house barn. She came back to find the roof done and Everett inside the shed, replacing the beam that had cracked, working by the light of a lantern he had hung from a hook he had brought with him. "You had a hook," she said. "I have a lot of things," he said. "I noticed." She handed him a thermos of coffee, and he set down the saw and drank it standing. And they talked about the 3rd ewe, who was having trouble, and the mud situation in the north pasture, and whether the forecast was reliable or wishful thinking. They talked the way people talk who are already used to each other, which they were, and which had happened without either of them deciding that it would. A neighbor's boy came by that same week, 17 years old. His name was Peter, and he had a calf that had gotten into trouble in a drainage ditch, and he didn't know how to manage it. He had stopped at the Hadley gate because it was the closest property, and Josephine was the one who had answered, and she had told him Everett was out at the back pasture. Peter had found him and stood there, hat in hand, scared of losing the calf and scared of asking for help from a man he didn't know. Everett put down what he was doing. He spent 2 hours in the ditch with the boy, getting the calf out and stable, and then he walked Peter through what to watch for in the next 24 hours, and what to do if the animal went into distress again. He didn't do it in a way that made the boy feel small. He did it in a way that made the boy feel like he could learn. Peter came back the next day to report that the calf was fine and to return a rope. George heard about it from the feed store before he heard about it from anyone on the property. By then, he had already known what he was going to say to Everett at the end of March. The last day came on a Friday afternoon, clear and cold and bright, the way Alberta afternoons can be in late March. The snow mostly gone, but the ground still hard, the light hitting the fields at an angle that made everything look like the beginning of something. George found Everett at the woodpile, splitting the last of the birch that had been stacked there since fall. He stood and watched him work for a minute. Everett worked the way he did everything, steady, efficient, no wasted motion. He was 47 years old, and he did not look like a man who was performing effort. He looked like a man for whom effort was simply the weather of a normal day. George said, "Put the axe down." Everett put it down. George said, "I told you to come back in spring. You came back. I told you I would. You fixed the shed roof before anyone asked you to. It needed fixing. You spent 2 hours in a ditch with a neighbor's boy for a calf that wasn't yours and a boy you'd never met." Everett said nothing. George looked at the woodpile. He looked at the field. He was 64 years old, and he had worked this land for 30 years, and he had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the measure of a man was not what he said when things were good. It was what he did when things were inconvenient. He said, "You should talk to Josephine." Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does she know to expect that?" "No," George said, "but she'll have an opinion about it. She always does." Everett almost smiled, that same almost she had noticed in August, the first day. He found her at the east fence line, which was where he had learned she went when she needed to think. She was standing at the gate, looking out at the field, and she heard him come up behind her, and she did not turn around right away. She was 26 years old, and she had been waiting for this conversation since December, and she had spent the last 4 months deciding what she thought, and she had come to the fence line to confirm it. He stood beside her. They were both quiet for a moment, looking at the field. The light was still that clear, slanted March light, and somewhere out in the pasture a ewe was calling, and the air smelled like mud and cold, and the very first suggestion of something thawing. He said, "I don't have a lot to offer you that you can't provide for yourself." "No," she said. "I have the Fort Macleod property," he said. 12 acres and a workshop and a house with a room or two left to finish. "You mentioned that," she said. "I'm 47, he said. "You're 26. I can do arithmetic," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What I'm asking is whether you think there's enough there for a life." She was quiet for longer than he was, long enough that a lesser man might have taken it for a no. He waited. She said, "I think a life is built the same way a house is." He looked at her. "1 room at a time," she said, "over as many winters as it takes." He said, "That's what I think, too." She turned and looked at him then directly, the full weight of her. She was 26 and she was serious, and she was not a woman who said things she did not mean. She said, "Then ask me." He asked her. She said yes. They were married in September, 6 months later, in the church at Pincher Creek. The same church whose roof Everett had repaired the previous year, which Josephine had pointed out to him the night before the wedding, with the dry satisfaction of someone who had noticed a good omen and was not going to let it pass without comment. He had laughed, a real laugh, open and unguarded, which Norma later said was the most certain she'd been that it was all going to be fine. George walked Josephine down the aisle on a knee that had no business doing so, and he did it without a cane and without complaint, because there are certain moments a father will not let his body take from him. He was 64 years old, and he did not cry until after, in the churchyard, with his back turned, which is the way of men of his generation in that part of the country. Norma cried immediately and without apology, which is also the way of the women. Josephine moved to the Fort Macleod property that fall. She did not give up the East Quarter. George's knee eventually required a surgery that went better than expected, and Josephine drove out twice a week through the winter, and in the spring she hired a young man from the next township who turned out to have good instincts and better hands. The East Quarter was fine. It was always going to be fine. Everett finished the last room of the house that winter, a proper workroom on the north side, with a long window that faced the field and good light for fine work. He built the shelves in it first, the way he always built things, starting with what would hold everything else. In the second year of their marriage, they had a son. They named him Arthur. He was born in March, during the mud and the cold, which Josephine said later was entirely appropriate. He had his father's hands and his mother's eyes and a stubborn silence that made George laugh every time he saw it. George was 66 that March, and he sat in the Fort Macleod kitchen and held the baby for a long time and said nothing. Then he said, to no one in particular, "He's going to be a good one." Everett, from across the room, said, "He comes from good people." George looked at him. His knee was better. His coffee was getting cold. Outside, the Alberta spring was doing what it always does, arriving slowly without fanfare in the way of things that intend to stay. He said, "Yes, he does. I've told you this story because I believe in the kind of man who shows up with the right wrench. Not the man who offers to do everything, and not the man who waits to be asked for everything, but the man who pays attention, who notices what is needed, and who gives it quietly and without keeping score. Those men are out there. I have known a few of them, and I believe in the kind of woman who brings out the right wrench herself, and then recognizes, eventually, the man who notices that she did. That is not a small thing. In a lifetime, if you are lucky, you meet one or two people who see you clearly and want exactly what you are, and not some improved or modified version. That is what Everett and Josephine had. That is what the house with the last room was waiting for. Wherever you are listening from today, whether you're watching the snow come down in Manitoba or drinking your morning coffee somewhere in Nova Scotia, I hope you have known that kind of quiet, sturdy love. And if you haven't yet, I hope you're still building toward it, one room at a time. God bless you all. Keep riding.